The emergency room was breathing. It was a rhythmic, heavy pulse of sliding doors, rolling gurneys, and the constant hum of monitors. In the center of the storm stood Maya. To the busy surgeons, she was invisible, just another paramedic delivering another patient. She stood by her empty stretcher, quiet and still. But while the specialist looked at the charts, Maya looked at the person. She noticed a tiny irregular twitch in the patient's jaw. She took a single step forward and spoke, her voice a calm anchor in the noise. "Wait," she said. One word. Total silence. "Now tell me, what did she actually really see?" The late afternoon sun was filtering through the high windows of the ambulance bay, casting long orange shadows across the concrete. For Maya, this was the most dangerous time of day. It wasn't because the calls were more frequent, it was because the exhaustion was setting in. In a hospital, exhaustion is a thief. It steals focus. It hides details. And Maya was the woman who lived for the details. The air in the bay smelled of diesel exhaust and old coffee, the scent of a long shift finally ending. She could feel the vibration of the idling engines through the soles of her boots, a familiar hum that usually signaled it was time to go home. But today, something felt unfinished. Her mind was still scanning the environment, picking up the frantic energy of the staff inside. She noticed how the fluorescent lights flickered, just slightly above the intake desk, and how the floor tiles felt slightly tacky under her weight. Every sensory input was a data point. Maya had been a paramedic for 5 years. In the hierarchy of the medical world, she knew exactly where she stood. To the high-level consultants and the chief residents, she was a transporter, a courier, someone who stabilized the situation in the field and then handed the real work over to the real experts. She had grown used to the way they looked past her, their eyes searching for the next set of lab results or a senior doctor's nod. She didn't mind the lack of recognition. Maya wasn't in this for the applause or the fancy title. She was in it because the back of an ambulance is a unique classroom. In those 20-minute rides through the city, you don't have a team of 10 people and $1 million of imaging equipment. You only have your eyes, your ears, and your hands. You learn to listen to the sound of a lung that isn't quite expanding right. You learn to feel the subtle change in skin temperature that signals a shift in internal pressure. You learn the language of the unspoken, the way a hand trembles or a gaze wanders. Today, the ER was particularly crowded. A multi-car accident on the highway had turned the quiet afternoon into a frantic race. Maya stood near the nurse's station, having just finished her report on a minor injury. She watched the chaos with a steady gaze. She saw a young doctor, Dr. Elias, rushing between 2 trauma bays. He was brilliant, she knew, but he was moving too fast. He was checking boxes in his mind, rushing to the next big problem. "Maya, we need this bay cleared," a senior nurse said, not unknowingly, but without looking up from her screen. "Good job on the handover. You can head back out." Maya nodded. She began to pull her stretcher away, but her eyes lingered on the patient in Bay 2. It was an elderly man, conscious but clearly disoriented. The team had diagnosed him with a simple concussion and a broken wrist. He was stable. He was routine. But Maya stopped. She didn't leave. She watched the way the man's chest rose. It was shallow, but only on the left side. It was a difference of maybe a few millimeters. Most people wouldn't see it. The monitors didn't pick it up because his overall oxygen levels were still within the safe range. But Maya saw the pattern. She remembered a call from 3 years ago, a similar routine case that had turned into a tragedy because everyone assumed the most obvious injury was the only one. She stood there feeling the familiar sting of hesitation. Should she say something? She was just a paramedic. If she was wrong, she was the girl who wasted the doctor's time during a mass casualty event. If she was right, she might save a man from a complication that hadn't even started yet. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a silent countdown in the sterile air. She watched Sarah, a young nurse, preparing to move the man to the imaging department. Sarah was friendly, but she was overwhelmed. She was looking at the man's wrist, making sure the splint was secure. She wasn't looking at his breathing. Maya took a breath. She didn't shout. She didn't create a scene. She simply walked over to the side of the bed. She didn't touch the patient. She just stood in Dr. Elias's peripheral vision as he walked past. "Doctor," she said quietly. He didn't stop. He was looking at a tablet. Not now, Maya. We're at capacity. It's about the man in Bay 2, she persisted, her voice steady. His tidal volume is shifting. Elias stopped. He turned around, his brow furrowed. He looked at the patient, then back at Maya. He saw a young woman in a dark blue uniform, her hair tied back, her expression unreadable. He saw a paramedic. His stats are fine, Maya, he said, his tone bordering on patronizing. We've got it from here. You have more calls waiting, don't you? Maya didn't flinch. She had been evaluated by people like him before. I'm not talking about the stats on the screen, she said softly. I'm talking about the movement of his diaphragm. It's lagging, just by a second. It doesn't match the rhythm of his speech. For a moment, the busy ER seemed to go quiet around them. Sarah, the nurse, paused. Two other interns looked over. The invisible professional had just challenged the real expert. The viewers of this moment would see a girl who was undervalued, but they would also see something else, a person who was no longer willing to be silent when she saw something that mattered. Maya wasn't trying to be a hero. She was trying to be a witness. And in that moment, she realized that being just a paramedic was exactly what gave her the perspective the others were missing. She had seen the patient before the sterile lights and the digital monitors took over. She knew the original rhythm, and the rhythm was wrong. Camila, the silence between Maya and Dr. Elias lasted only a few seconds, but in the high-stakes environment of the ER, it felt like an eternity. Elias was a man who prided himself on his diagnostic speed. He felt the weight of the other patients waiting for him, the pressure of the clock, and the ego that comes with a white coat. He wanted to dismiss her. He wanted to walk away and focus on the real emergencies. But there was something in Maya's eyes. It wasn't defiance, it was certainty, a cold, quiet certainty that cut through the noise of the sirens outside. Maya, we don't have time for feelings right now, Elias said, though his voice had lost some of its sharp edge. It's not a feeling, doctor, Maya replied. It's a physical observation. Look at the intercostal muscles. The left side is pulling harder. He's compensating. Elias sighed, but he stepped closer to the bed. He pulled back the man's gown. He watched. At first, he saw nothing. The man was breathing. He was talking. He looked fine. But Elias forced himself to wait. He stopped looking at his tablet. He stopped thinking about the next patient. He just looked. He abandoned the digital world and returned to the physical one, the world of muscle and bone. And then he saw it. The patient took a deep breath to answer a question from Sarah. The right side of his chest expanded fully. The left side? It hesitated. It was a tiny microscopic stutter in the movement, a lag. It was as if the lung was fighting an invisible weight, a phantom pressure that only Maya had noticed in the rush. Maya was right. Sarah, Elias said, his voice now entirely professional. Cancel the wrist x-ray for now. Get him on a portable ultrasound. I want to look at the pleural space. Now. The team moved. The dismissiveness was gone, replaced by a sudden, sharp focus. The interns who had been watching with amusement were now leaning in, trying to see what the paramedic had seen. They were looking for the magic Maya had used to spot the invisible. The atmosphere shifted from routine to investigative, a quiet hunt for a hidden danger. The internal tension for Maya was still there. She felt the eyes of the staff on her. Some looked impressed, others looked annoyed that she had been right. She felt the familiar urge to just disappear, to get back into the safety of her ambulance and drive away. But she stayed. She stayed because the patient wasn't out of the woods yet. While the ultrasound was being set up, a senior Waita, a woman named Elena who had worked there for 30 years, walked over to Maya. Elena had seen everything. She had seen brilliant surgeons make mistakes and janitors save lives. You've got a good eye, kid, Elena whispered. Most people here see the injury. They don't see the person. Don't let them talk you out of what you see. Maya gave a small, appreciative nod. I just didn't want it to get missed. It's easy to miss things when it's this loud. That's the truth, Elena agreed. Loudness is the enemy of the truth. The ultrasound began. The screen showed the grainy, black and white landscape of the man's chest. For the first minute, it looked normal. But then, as the probe moved higher, Elias stopped. There it is, he whispered, a small, hidden pocket of fluid. It wasn't a massive collapse, but it was a slow bleed, a complication from a rib fracture that hadn't shown up on the initial physical exam. If they had sent him to the imaging department, the movement could have worsened it. If they had discharged him, he might not have made it through the night. The silence in the bay grew heavy as the reality of the miss sank in. It wasn't a dramatic save. There was no blood spraying, no yelling, no jumping on the bed to perform CPR. It was a quiet save, a save made by a woman who refused to rush. The mystery for the staff was no longer, who is she, but how did she see it? They began to realize that Maya wasn't just a paramedic. She was a different kind of specialist. She was a specialist in the beginning of the story. Maya watched as they began the procedure to drain the fluid. She saw the man's breathing immediately become more synchronized. The lag was gone. The rhythm was restored. She felt a sense of relief, but she didn't celebrate. She didn't say, "I told you so." She simply turned back to her stretcher and began to walk toward the exit. She had a job to do. There were more patients out there, more rhythms to listen to, and more details waiting to be noticed. As she pushed the heavy doors open, she heard Dr. Elias call out behind her. "Maya!" She stopped and turned. Elias walked toward her, his expression a mix of embarrassment and genuine respect. I should have listened the first time. Thank you. Truly." "It's okay, doctor," Maya said. "You were busy looking at the problem. I was just lucky enough to be looking at the man." "It wasn't luck," Elias said, shaking his head. "It was something else." He didn't have a word for it yet, but the rest of the staff did. They were already whispering about the paramedic with the eagle eyes. The mystery was fading, but the respect was just beginning to grow. Maya wasn't just a part of the background anymore. She was a person with a voice that could save a life with a single quiet word. The adrenaline of the save had passed, leaving a strange, quiet hum in the emergency department. The routine patient was now tucked into a recovery bed, his breathing deep and even. But the atmosphere in the staff lounge was different. There was no celebration, but there was a shift in the gravity of the room. Dr. Elias was sitting at a small table, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hands. He was a man who had spent 15 years in school to get where he was. He had passed the hardest exams, worked the longest hours, and seen the most complex cases. And yet, a young woman who had likely spent only 2 years in a vocational program had seen something he hadn't. He looked up as Maya walked past the lounge on her way to the supply room. "Maya, do you have a minute?" Maya hesitated, then stepped into the room. She felt out of place here. This was the sanctuary for the doctors and the senior nurses. She felt the weight of her dusty boots on the clean tile. "I keep thinking about it," Elias said, gesturing for her to sit. "The way you saw it. I've been a doctor for a long time. I've seen thousands of patients. Why didn't I see the lag?" Maya sat down, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look for a way to make him feel better, but she didn't want to make him feel worse either. "It's not because you're a bad doctor," she said softly. "It's because of the way you're trained to think." "What do you mean?" "In medical school, they teach you to look for the big bad," Maya explained. "You look for the heart attack, the stroke, the massive trauma. You look for the things that kill people in 5 minutes. And you're amazing at it. You're the best in the city at catching the big bad." She paused, looking at her own hands, calloused from lifting stretchers and holding hands in dark ambulances. "But in the field, in the ambulance, we don't have the tools to look for the big bad. We have to look for the small wrong. We have to notice the way a person's voice changes when they're lying about their pain. We have to notice the way their eyes track the light. We spend 20 minutes in a small, vibrating box with one person. We have nothing to do but look. We learn the texture of the silence before a person stops fighting." Elias nodded, absorbing this. "So you didn't see the fluid. You saw the small wrong." "Exactly," Maya said. "It didn't match. Everything else was saying he was fine, but his body was saying he was tired. And bodies don't get tired for no reason. I learned that the hard way." "The hard way?" Maya looked away out the window toward the ambulance bay. 3 years ago, a woman with a broken leg. She was laughing, joking. I thought she was fine. I didn't notice that she was breathing a little too fast. I thought she was just excited. By the time we got to the hospital, she had a pulmonary embolism. She lived, but barely. It was my fault for not seeing the small wrong because I was too focused on the broken leg. I saw the bone. I didn't see the life behind it. I carry that weight every time I step onto the truck. She looked back at Elias. I promised myself I would never let the obvious thing blind me again. I'd rather be the annoying paramedic who asks too many questions than the one who lets a detail slip by. Elias felt a surge of respect that he hadn't felt for anyone in a long time. He realized that Maya wasn't just a paramedic. She was a master of a different craft, the craft of presence. You know, he said, a lot of people in my position would be too proud to admit they missed something. They'd find a way to take credit for the final diagnosis. But I want the team to know what you did. I want them to learn from you. Maya shook her head quickly. Please don't. I don't want the attention. I want them to listen. Next time someone lower than them says something, I want them to actually hear it. That's all the credit I need. We are a team, not a pyramid. Elias smiled. I think that's going to happen. You've made quite an impression. As Maya left the lounge, she felt a different kind of energy from the staff. It wasn't shock, it was a soft respect. She walked past the nurse's station, and Sarah, the young nurse from before, stopped her. Sarah looked a little embarrassed. I'm sorry I was so rushed earlier, Maya. I should have been looking at him, not the equipment. It happens to the best of us, Sarah, Maya said kindly. Just remember, the machines are there to help us, but the patient is there to tell us the truth. Listen to the person first. Sarah nodded, her eyes bright. I will, thank you. Maya felt a warmth in her chest. She realized that she hadn't just saved a patient, she had started a conversation. She had shown them that value isn't found in a title, but in the quality of your attention. It was a lesson in humility that the sterile walls of the hospital desperately needed. The Maya effect didn't change the hospital overnight with a grand ceremony. It happened in the quiet moments, in the way the staff moved and spoke. It was a subtle shift in the culture of the emergency department. A few days later, a new intern was rushing to a case. He was about to dismiss the report from an older janitor who had noticed a strange smell in the patient's room. Before the intern could walk away, Dr. Elias stepped in. Wait, Elias said. What did you smell exactly? The janitor explained, and Elias spent an extra 5 minutes investigating. They found a leak in a medication line that could have been disastrous. The intern looked at Elias in surprise. He's the one in the room the most, Elias said simply. He notices things we don't. Listen to everyone. The staff began to adopt a new rule, the 10-second pause. Before any patient was moved or a final diagnosis was made, they would stop for 10 seconds. They would look at the person. They would listen to the room. They would ask the person who had spent the most time with the patient if they noticed any small wrongs. This simple pause saved 3 lives in the first week alone, all from complications that would have gone unnoticed in the rush. The residents began to carry small pocket-sized notebooks, just like Maya's, jotting down the human data that their digital charts couldn't capture. They found that these notes often held the key to the most stubborn cases. The environment felt less like an assembly line and more like a collaborative study of life. It was as if the hospital had finally opened its eyes. Maya continued her work as if nothing had happened. She was still the quiet, steady paramedic who arrived at 6 a.m., but she noticed that people were looking at her differently. They weren't looking through her anymore. They were looking at her. They were waiting for her input. One afternoon, Maya was handing over a patient to Sarah. After the report was done, Sarah paused. Is there anything else, Maya? Sarah asked. Anything you saw in the ambulance that isn't on the chart? Maya smiled. Actually, yes. He kept rubbing his left ear. It might be nothing, but he only did it when the siren was off. It might be a pressure issue, not just the head injury. Sarah didn't dismiss it. She wrote it down. Got it. I'll make sure the doctor checks it. Thanks for the catch. The respect was mutual. Maya found herself being more confident, too. She wasn't afraid to speak up anymore. She realized that her voice wasn't just hers. It was the voice of the patient when they couldn't speak for themselves. She shared this mindset with the other paramedics, too. During their breaks, she would talk to the younger recruits. Don't just be a driver, she would tell them. Be a witness. Your eyes are the most important equipment on that truck. Don't let anyone tell you that you're just anything. Every heartbeat is a story, and you're the first person to read it. One evening, Dr. Elias saw Maya in the parking lot as they were both leaving. "Hey, Maya," he called out. She turned, her keys in her hand. "Hi, doctor. I just wanted you to know I'm starting a new training module for the residents. We're calling it Field Perspective. I'd love for you to come and talk to them. Tell them about the small wrongs." Maya was stunned. "You want me to teach residents?" "I want them to be better doctors," Elias said. "And to do that, they need to know how to see. You're the best teacher I know for that." Maya felt a lump in her throat. "I'd be honored." The hospital wasn't just a place of medicine anymore. It was a place of listening. The hierarchy was still there, but it was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. And Maya was the one who had built it, one quiet wait at a time. The story of Maya isn't just about a paramedic and a doctor. It's a story about the way we see the world. We live in a culture that celebrates the loudest voices and the most visible successes. We think that importance is measured by the length of a title or the size of a paycheck. We rush past the small wrongs because we are too busy chasing the big wins. But the truth is, the world is held together by the people who notice the details. It is the teacher who sees the quiet student in the back of the room. It is the technician who hears the slight rattle in the engine. It is the friend who notices the crack in your voice when you say you're fine. It is the quiet revolution of empathy. When we look at one another not as obstacles or tasks, but as complex stories waiting to be understood, we change the very nature of our work. We begin to see that every role, no matter how small, holds a piece of the larger truth. We find that wisdom doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a dusty uniform and carries a worn-out stretcher. In any environment, a hospital, a school, an office, we are only as strong as our ability to listen to one another. When we decide that someone is just a certain role, we are choosing to blind ourselves to the value they bring. We miss the patterns, we miss the truth. Maya's superpower wasn't a secret medical knowledge. It was the courage to be present. It was the willingness to risk being wrong in order to be right for someone else. It was the strength to speak when silence was easier. Mistakes don't usually start as disasters. They start as a lag in the rhythm. They start as a detail that was too small to notice. If we want to prevent the big explosions, we have to start by tending to the tiny sparks. We have to learn to value the invisible labor of observation. Think about your own life. Who are the invisible people in your day? Who are the ones you look through? And more importantly, what are you missing because you're in too much of a rush? Perhaps there is a small wrong waiting for your attention right now, a detail that could change everything if you just chose to stop. Excellence isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being the person who cares enough to stay in the room, even when it's loud. It's about having the humility to learn from the person standing next to you, no matter what uniform they are wearing. Maya continues to drive her ambulance through the streets of the city. She still stands in the corners of the ER, quiet and observant. She is still just a paramedic to those who don't know her. But to those who do, she is a reminder. She is a reminder that the most important thing you can do for another human being is to truly, deeply, and patiently see them. Sometimes the difference between a tragedy and a triumph is just one moment where someone chose to look again. What will you notice today? Who will you finally see? The rhythm of the world is waiting for you to listen. Don't rush past it. The most beautiful truths are often the quietest ones. Just like Maya, you have the power to change everything simply by choosing to pay attention. One move, total silence, and a world made better by the woman who refused to look away.